August 3rd, 1944. Dawn crawled slowly over the grey sprawl of London. The air still smelled of burnt brick and aviation fuel. The war had ground into its fifth brutal year, and the city wore its scars like medals. Shattered windows patched with cardboard, soot clinging to cathedrals, searchlights cutting pale fingers through a fading mist. On the Thames embankment, military trucks coughed to life, their olive-drab silhouettes swallowed by fog. Somewhere among them sat a young woman gripping the steering wheel of a jeep, a 21-year-old private from Ohio, her brown hair tucked under a creased cap, eyes fixed on the horizon. Her name was Ilene Hall. U.S. Army Personnel Log, August 1944. She had been a farmer's daughter once, a small-town dreamer who loved swimming and wide skies. But love had rewritten her fate. 2 years earlier, she'd met Kenneth Hall, tall, quiet, steady, at a local dance in Ohio. They'd married quickly, as so many did in wartime. A week later, he was gone, shipped to Europe to fight in the Italian campaign. Letters crossed the Atlantic, worn at the edges from passing hands and sensors. Each carried a trace of his scent, a fragment of his handwriting, a promise. When this is over, I'll find you. But as winter closed over Europe, Ilene decided she wouldn't wait to be found. Personal correspondence, Hall Family Archive. The Women's Army Corps, the WACs, had opened its ranks to women of determination. On her 20th birthday, Ilene walked into a recruitment office, handed over a paper her father signed reluctantly, and enlisted. The recruiter raised an eyebrow when she asked for motor transport duty. Most girls prefer clerical, he warned. She smiled. I prefer engines. WAC Recruitment Office Memo, 1942. By the summer of 44, Ilene's Jeep had become an extension of her body. The vehicle was a Willys MB, 60 horsepower, 4-cylinder, designed by American Bantam and perfected in Detroit by engineers who built them faster than any army could destroy them. They were light enough to lift by hand, rugged enough to climb mountains. Ilene knew every sound the engine made, every vibration under her boots. She drove colonels through blacked-out roads, supply convoys through bombed villages, and dispatched riders across the countryside. Her uniform bore grease stains and pride in equal measure. U.S. Army Motor Pool Report, 1944. Every night she listened to the distant hum of German bombers. When the sirens wailed, she ducked beneath her cot as V-1 rockets passed overhead, their pulse jets sputtering like mechanical heartbeats before silence. And then, an explosion. You could tell when the engine stopped, she'd recall. That's when you prayed. British Home Defence Audio Archive, 1944. London's blackout concealed both fear and courage. The pubs still played music, and soldiers still danced when they could. It was on one such evening, her 21st birthday, that Ilene's commanding officer threw her a small celebration. She was the only enlisted woman in a room full of officers, but she laughed easily, her accent softening the formal edges of their uniforms. For a few hours, she'd later write, we forgot there was a war. Private Diary, Ilene Hall, 1944. But the war never forgot them. That autumn, after months of night driving through rain and rubble, Ilene received new orders. Transfer to the 23rd Base Post Office, Paris. The city had just been liberated. Rumours of its beauty mingled with warnings. Mines, snipers, shortages. As her ship crossed the channel, she stood on deck watching the French coast rise from the mist, its shoreline pocked with wreckage. Beneath her boots, the steel hull trembled. I was finally crossing the same sea my husband had crossed, she wrote, but I didn't know if he was still alive. U.S. Army Transport Manifest, Sept. 1944. Paris was a wounded jewel. Streets once filled with laughter now echoed with the rattle of military trucks. The 23rd Post Office operated from a converted theatre on Rue de Grenelle, its stage covered in sacks of mail, its orchestra pit filled with typewriters. Every letter that passed through Ilene's hands carried a heartbeat from one front to another, from the Ardennes to Anzio, from Sicily to Saipan. Thousands of soldiers wrote home about love, fear, and boredom. She sorted their hopes alphabetically. Army Postal Service Report, Oct. 1944. One evening, while she was cataloguing a fresh bundle of mail, a familiar name stopped her cold. Private First Class Kenneth Hall, Field Artillery Battalion, Italy. The return address blurred before her eyes. After weeks of silence, his handwriting felt like the sound of home. In it, Ken wrote of the mud, the mountains, the endless shelling. He mentioned friends who hadn't made it through the night, "I don't talk about it much," he wrote. "But sometimes I wish I could close my eyes and see you instead of all this." Field Artillery Battalion mail log. Italy, 1944. Ilene folded the letter carefully, her fingers trembling. He was alive, for now, but she knew enough to read between the lines. Italy was a graveyard of divisions. The Gothic line had stalled Allied progress for months. Men died for ridges that barely had names. She pictured him crouched in a foxhole under mortar fire, rain pooling in his boots, clutching the photo she'd sent. Somewhere, in that same storm, he might be thinking the same thought she had that night. Maybe love can survive a world like this. When the German counterattack in the Ardennes began that December, the air itself seemed to harden. The Battle of the Bulge tore through the Allied front, killing thousands. Wounded men flooded into Paris by the truckload. Hospitals overflowed. Hallways became triage wards. The WACs were called to assist. Ilene filled a transport truck with volunteers and drove them straight into chaos. She'd never seen so much blood. The wounded lay on stretchers from wall to wall. You could barely walk sideways between them, she'd later say. We just did whatever made them smile. Army Medical Corps debrief. Jan 1945. Among the stretchers, one soldier with a bandaged leg told her he'd never seen Paris. "I hate to go home without seeing it once," he murmured. Ilene didn't hesitate. The next morning, she borrowed a jeep, loaded 2 fellow WACs, and took him on a tour of the city. Notre Dame, the Champs-Élysées, the Eiffel Tower, gleaming under rationed light. For an hour, she said, he wasn't a casualty. He was a soldier in Paris. WAC service log, 1945. That night, fireworks from the liberation still glimmered faintly over the Seine, but the war was not yet done. Another letter came, short, almost rushed. Ken's unit was being reassigned to the China-Burma-India theatre. "Don't worry," he wrote. "It won't be for long." Ilene read it 3 times, then stared at her reflection in the darkened window. Outside, the city hummed with celebration. Inside, she was already planning, because she had decided one thing, clear as steel in her heart. If he was going to the ends of the earth, she was going to find him. U.S. Army Correspondence Archive, March 1945. The spring of 1945 bled into Europe with the color of rust and rain. The Reich was collapsing, yet its death throes were violent and unpredictable. Roads, once ruled by panzer divisions, now crawled with Allied convoys. Columns of weary men and women in uniform who refused to be left behind. Among them was Private Ilene Hall of the Women's Army Corps, her uniform dusty from the French highways, her jeep idling beneath the rising sun outside Paris. She held a folded letter, orders stamped with the seal of General Mark Clark's Fifth Army, directing her to report for transport duty in Italy. On paper, it was a reassignment. In truth, it was something else entirely, a calculated risk born of love and defiance. U.S. Army Transportation Orders, March 1945. She had convinced her commanding officer that she could be of use to the logistics teams re-establishing routes through the newly liberated Italian peninsula. But the paperwork carried a different story between its lines. A personal mission to find one man among hundreds of thousands scattered across the Italian front. "They said I was being transferred," she'd recall later. "But really, I was chasing a heartbeat across a continent." Oral History Interview, 1978. Her journey began at Orly Airfield, just south of Paris. It was a raw morning, wind slicing through the fuselage of C-47 transports lined up like sleeping metal beasts. Ilene approached a flight officer and told him her story, that her husband was serving in Italy, and she had orders to join his army group. The officer, struck by her resolve, pointed to a bomber preparing to depart. "That one's heading south," he said. "We'll hold it for you." Air Transport Command Logbook, 1945. Minutes later, she was being lifted by 2 grinning GIs into the open bomb bay of a B-17 Flying Fortress. The aircraft roared to life, its Wright Cyclone engines thundering as it rose into the clouds. Ilene clutched her duffel, seated awkwardly near the gun turret. Below, Europe stretched like a torn map, rivers twisting through the scars of war, towns smoking in the distance. It felt, she wrote, like flying over the ashes of everything we'd lost. Personal diary. Hall papers. When the B-17 touched down at Leghorn, Livorno, as the locals called it, she stepped onto Italian soil for the first time. The port was a wasteland of twisted cranes and shattered docks. The smell of oil and salt hung thick in the air. Somewhere beyond the Apennine Mountains, her husband's artillery battalion was still in the field. She didn't know which road led to him, only that she was willing to take any. Mediterranean Theatre Command Report 1945. The Willys MB Jeep that carried Ilene across Italy was more than a machine. It was an icon of American ingenuity. Designed in 1940 under a 49-day crash program, the original prototype by Karl Probst of Bantam was refined by Willys Overland engineers into the MB, a 2,450-pound, four-wheel drive miracle that could climb 60-degree grades and ford 21-inch streams. It was powered by the Go Devil engine, a 2.2-litre inline-4 capable of pushing the Jeep to 65 miles per hour on open ground. Every bolt, every hinge had been engineered for simplicity and speed of repair. In wartime Italy, that meant survival. Technical Manual TM 9803, 1944. WAC drivers like Ilene were trained not just to drive but to repair, to change gearboxes, patch tyres, and bleed brake lines under fire. Mechanics in olive drab jumpsuits worked in open fields, improvising tools from scrap. They could keep a Jeep running on prayers and baling wire, one officer wrote admiringly. Quartermaster Corps Memo, 1945. As Ilene hitched a ride with two British soldiers heading toward Rome, she passed convoys of GMC CCKW deuce-and-a-half trucks carrying ammunition, food, and medical supplies northward. The Italian countryside blurred. Villages rebuilt with Allied rations, vineyards scarred by tank treads. The war had ended in the headlines, but not in the hearts of those who'd lived through it. Allied Convoy Report, April 1945. While Ilene crossed Europe, her husband Ken was fighting through one of the war's most punishing fronts, the Gothic Line in northern Italy. It stretched from the Ligurian coast through the Apennines to the Adriatic, fortified with bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and concrete pillboxes. Ken's unit, the 338th Field Artillery Battalion, supported the 85th Infantry Division during the spring offensive of 1945. The terrain was brutal, steep ridges, minefields hidden under chest-high grass, rain that turned the roads to mud. 5th Army Field Report, March 1945. The Germans fought with the desperation of the cornered. Their 80mm guns barked from camouflaged slopes, while Nebelwerfer rockets screamed through the fog. Every hill cost blood, one soldier wrote. You couldn't see the enemy, just flashes and echoes. Soldier's letter, dramatized composite. Ken's battery fired hundreds of 150mm shells daily, their thunder echoing across valleys. The M114 howitzer, 5,800 pounds of steel precision, was accurate to within 25 meters at 10,000 yards. Each shell weighed nearly 100 pounds, filled with TNT or white phosphorus. Crews worked in shifts, loading, aiming, and cleaning the barrels under constant shell fire. Artillerymen learned to read the terrain like surgeons reading anatomy. Ordnance Department Technical Bulletin, 1944. One night, under steady rain near Bologna, Ken volunteered to take a watch shift for a frightened comrade. Minutes later, a German shell struck the foxhole he'd just vacated. The blast threw dirt and shrapnel across the hillside. When the smoke cleared, the men inside were gone. Ken stood motionless, covered in mud, staring at the crater that should have been his grave. Unit Action After Report, April 1945. It was one of countless moments of chance that defined the Italian campaign. A war fought not for glory, but for inches. By the time the Allies broke through to the Po Valley, they had suffered over 300,000 casualties. The Wehrmacht's will had finally cracked, but at a cost that left both sides hollow. U.S. Army Statistical Summary, 1946. Meanwhile, Ilene's own route took her through the same mountains. She rode in the back of a Bedford lorry with the British soldiers, the wind clawing at her face as the road climbed through the green, rain-soaked ridges of the Apennines. The truck rattled over wooden bridges and past burned-out vehicles, American, German, Italian alike. The world looked like it had been picked apart by giants, she would later say. WAC Veteran Testimony, 1947. When they reached Rome, the Eternal City was scarred but alive. American Red Cross staff greeted her with cautious curiosity. They offered her a bunk, warm food, and advice. Don't travel north alone. But Ilene couldn't wait. She joined a Sunday service in a nearby chapel, where sunlight streamed through shattered, stained glass. A soldier noticed her unfamiliar patch and asked where she was from. When she told him, he nodded slowly. "Wait here," he said. "I might know someone who can help." Red Cross station log. April 1945. An hour later, he returned with permission and a truck. Her husband was in Milan. It was nearly 400 miles north. The road ahead crossed the Po Valley, still dotted with retreating German remnants and partisan patrols. But Ilene was beyond hesitation. Every mile felt like a prayer, she wrote. Hall Personal Memoir, 1953. They drove through ruined towns, the truck bouncing over bomb craters. Smoke from burned farms drifted across the plains. Once, near Modena, they stopped to let a funeral procession pass. Civilians carrying a coffin draped in an Italian flag, marching in silence. War had ended officially, but mourning still marched beside the living. Italian Civilian Report, May 1945. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking Milan, the air changed, warmer, gentler, filled with the hum of rebuilding. Her escort pointed to the horizon. "That's your city," he said quietly. Ilene could barely breathe. After 3 years, 4 countries, and one impossible mission, she was about to find him. She would reach his camp half an hour later, and what happened next would become one of the most improbable reunions of the Second World War. U.S. Army Reunion Report, May 1945. The camp sat quiet beneath the Italian sky. Its tents stretched across a field that smelled faintly of diesel and spring rain. The guns had fallen silent, and for the first time in years, the horizon didn't promise thunder. Soldiers wandered between rows of canvas, unsure what to do with the sudden peace. A few wrote letters. Others stared into space, listening to the wind. Near the edge of the camp, an artilleryman looked up from cleaning a 155mm howitzer. Someone was shouting his name. Kenneth Hall! He turned, and there she was, a figure in a WAC uniform, boots caked with road dust, eyes bright with disbelief. For a second, neither moved. Then he ran, crossing the muddy ground in long, stumbling strides until his arms closed around her. "I told you I'd find you," she whispered. But in truth, she had been the one who crossed an entire continent to make that promise real. 5th Army Reunion Report, May 1945. For the soldiers who watched, the moment was something sacred amid the wreckage. The war had devoured millions of stories, yet here was one that survived. A reminder of why any of them had fought at all. Even hardened veterans turned away, blinking at the sting of tears. It was like seeing light come back into the world, one wrote later. U.S. Veterans Oral History Collection, 1948. The impact of that reunion went far beyond sentiment. It embodied the spirit of a force that had quietly changed modern warfare, the Women's Army Corps. By the end of 1945, over 150,000 women had served in roles once thought impossible. Cryptographers, drivers, mechanics, radio operators, medics, map analysts. They manned switchboards that coordinated invasions, delivered mail across front lines, decoded enemy transmissions, and repaired the vehicles that kept armies moving. They proved that industrial and information warfare no longer belonged solely to men. War Department Statistical Review, 1946. Behind every battle, there were women like Ilene, drivers who navigated mine-strewn roads, clerks who typed orders through air raids, and nurses who worked 20-hour shifts beneath flickering lights. Their discipline held together the machinery of an army stretched across 3 continents. Victory, General Eisenhower later said, was impossible without the WACs. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Statement, 1945. From a strategic standpoint, the Corps represented a new kind of force multiplier. Each WAC who took over an administrative or logistical post freed a trained soldier for combat duty. The Army estimated that for every 12 women deployed overseas, an entire company of men could be reassigned to the front. That arithmetic of efficiency, of precision human logistics, was one of the quiet revolutions of the Second World War. War Manpower Commission Report, 1945. But numbers alone couldn't measure the psychological effect. Across the Atlantic, Axis propagandists had mocked the idea of women in uniform. The Wehrmacht dismissed them as soft auxiliaries. Yet captured German documents later revealed astonishment at the WWII's technical competence and mobility. One interrogated officer admitted, "We could not understand how your army never seemed to sleep." Dramatized composite. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Interrogations, 1946. The truth was simpler. The Allied war machine didn't sleep because women like Ilene refused to. While bomber crews rested between missions, WWII drivers refueled their trucks. When communications lines broke, Female radio techs worked through the night, tuning frequencies by ear, their fingers steady despite the distant rumble of artillery. Signal Corps Operations Summary, 1944. Even after Germany's surrender, their work wasn't done. Europe was a continent of ruins, its infrastructure shattered, its people starving. The same logistics networks that had once carried ammunition now transported food, medicine, and displaced civilians. WAC convoys rolled through towns where children waved American flags made from scrap cloth. "We went from fighting a war to rebuilding the world," one veteran recalled. Allied Occupation Report, 1946. In the months that followed, Ilene and Ken spent their brief leave at Lake Como in a villa once reserved for generals. 8 days of stolen peace. The water was glassy and blue, the air scented with pine. For the first time since their hurried wedding 3 years before, they were alone. "It felt unreal," she'd say later, "like the war had been a nightmare we woke from together." Personal letter, June 1945. Yet both carried invisible scars. Ken had seen comrades vaporized by artillery, bridges collapsing under fire, entire villages erased. Ilene had seen wards lined with broken men, faces too young to have witnessed such horror. When she looked at him across the quiet room, she knew that love alone wouldn't erase what they'd endured, but it would help them rebuild. That too was victory. After their return home, the adjustment was uneasy. America celebrated, but many veterans struggled to fit into the peacetime rhythm. Factories retooled from tanks to toasters. Men came home expecting the same world they'd left. Women were expected to return quietly to kitchens, but not Ilene. She spoke at schools and veterans' halls about the WACs, about service and sacrifice beyond the front lines. "We proved we could stand where history told us we couldn't," she'd tell audiences. Canton Veterans Association transcript, 1947. The legacy of her generation rippled through the decades that followed. When the US Air Force created its Women in the Air Force Division in 1948, it drew heavily from WAC logistics manuals. The same communication protocols and maintenance standards used in Italy became templates for Cold War mobilization. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the Persian Gulf, the fingerprints of those early pioneers remained. Department of Defense Doctrinal Review, 1952. Technological progress would soon transform the battlefields they once drove across. Radios evolved into encrypted networks, jeep convoys became mechanized logistics systems guided by satellites, and the simple ethos of "keep it running no matter what" became the foundation of modern operational doctrine. Every supply chain traced its lineage back to those first improvised routes across war-torn Europe. Army Field Logistics Analysis, 1961. Psychologically, the war had taught a harsher truth. Courage was not limited to those who carried rifles. It existed in those who carried hope. For Ilene, the war was both a crucible and a calling, a test of whether love could outlast destruction. The reunion in Milan wasn't just personal redemption. It symbolized humanity's stubborn refusal to surrender meaning, even in catastrophe. Years later, when historians interviewed her for a veterans project, she smiled when asked if she'd do it again. "Yes," she said. "Every mile, every bomb, every night on the road, because he was out there, and because I could." Dramatized, Veteran Oral History, 1982. Her words echoed what many of her generation understood, but rarely said aloud. Wars are fought by nations, but won by people, by the hands that drive trucks, patch uniforms, deliver letters, and keep engines alive, by those who, in defiance of fear, choose compassion over surrender. As twilight settled over her Ohio hometown decades later, Ilene would sometimes sit by the window, tracing the faint scars on her hands where oil and grease had once stained her skin. The radio played softly, Glenn Miller fading into static. Outside, the world she helped save moved on, faster and brighter. But for her, every sound of an engine still carried memory. Every road still led back to that moment in the Italian sun when love met survival. "In war," she once said, "you learn what really matters. You learn that victory isn't about winning battles. It's about finding your way back to the person you love. No matter how far, no matter what stands in your way." And so, the story of Private Ilene Hall and her impossible journey across a dying continent became more than a tale of love. It became a testament to courage without rank, to endurance without orders, and to a generation that proved that even in humanity's darkest hours, light can still find a way through the smoke. U.S. Veterans Memorial Oral Record, 1995.